Right, this is the 7th workshop in a series of 7, and it's a summary of the previous workshops, so just very condensed what we did, and then we're going to have a look at the finished piece and see if we can work into it and improve on it. So we were looking at the work of Sunga Park and her architectural drawings, and we were looking at the formal elements, we was looking at line, and we was looking at colour. We was looking at how she's used line to focus on certain areas of the drawings and to really give a lot of information about those areas, but then not hardly any information at all in other areas, and it kind of gives it a very sort of like floaty, mystical, fantasy kind of feeling. Her paintings have been described as sort of the dreamy architecture paintings, and it's this kind of style that we have been trying to recreate. So we can see that she's used some sort of technical pen like fine liner. We tried out different fine liners, we tried out different inks. We've looked at using watercolour and using a technique called wet in wet, which just means that you're using wet paint on a wet surface, and it gives you this very kind of where colours sort of merge together. So rather than mixing them necessarily in a palette sort of separately, you're allowing them to sort of bleed into each other and mix on the surface of the paper. And it can be very unpredictable, but it can give you some really lovely sort of surprise, kind of happy accident kind of parts of your painting as well. So we had a look at her work, we identified key areas. We also identified that the watercolour paint was only applied to within the building setting, but also there was areas that were missed. The intensity of colour was only focused on areas where there's also a lot of pen and a lot of line. It gives that kind of feeling as though there's sort of like a mist or a fog that's rolling in. It gives it kind of like a very mystical feeling. So the next phase was to have a look at our own images and how we can use that style. So instead of looking at trying to recreate one of her paintings, we was thinking what should we do for ourselves to sort of develop our own ideas. So I found some images on the internet. Now usually we'd look at going out and taking photos or going out and taking sketches, but this is a time of the COVID-19 lockdown, so I've looked on the internet. I found a building from Birmingham and a couple of buildings from Oxford, which I thought could be quite successful. So to test them out, we first of all trace them out. Now for this one, this is a university in Oxford, and I used normal tracing paper that you'd find in your art department or in art shops, and I sort of decided that I would only, like Sunga Park, only focus on areas, not everything. So little details, little bits of information, your brain kind of fills in the rest. The outline is important, and where you do have detail, really go to town on the detail. So I looked at that. Then I looked at this one, which is it's called the Radcliffe's Camera in Oxford, and because again it was the lockdown and things were a little bit tricky to get, I showed you how you could use baking greaseproof paper. So if you've got someone in the family that likes baking, greaseproof paper is a great, you can use it instead of tracing paper. It does the same thing. So I found this picture, used greaseproof paper, traced around it. Again, not everything, got the outline, looked at certain areas of the work, went into a little bit more detail, and thought that actually I quite like that shape. I could see that I could use it. I could see that sort of if I come down here with the watercolour paint, that it would get more watery as you get further down. I did notice in her work as well, if I just bring it back, that she doesn't use any colour in the sky, and you rarely see the ground. You rarely see the ground in front of the building. So it kind of gives you a little bit of, so you can just focus on certain areas, because that's all the work is about, isn't it? For me, anyway. We then went on to have a go at trying out different colours and different fine liners and technical pens, because students, they have all sorts of pens at home. We've tried different names and then put water over the top to see if they're water resistant. We even tried using food colouring, black food colouring. One worked better than the other, but it's not water resistant, so I went back to use this pen up here, which I felt gave a really nice smooth fine line, something that I was looking for. Then, because we're using a technique called wet in wet, where the waters bleed into each other, it's a good idea to try and work out how those colours are going to look once they've sort of merged into each other. So I used 3 groups of 3 and thought, okay, what can I do? Just move them in. Plenty of pigment, make sure you have plenty of pigment. That was the one thing that was important, and just see how they run into each other. In the end, I used this group of colours, and on this side of the paper, first of all, I traced out my tracing with pencil, and I went over it with my fine liner, which I'd already practiced with, and I'd already found that it was waterproof. If I'd have put that down first and it hadn't been waterproof, then as soon as I put my watercolour paint over the top, it would have just ran, and it would have vanished, it would have disappeared. So it's very important to test out your pens first. It gives you more options. If you're using a waterproof pen, you can put it on first, paint on the top. You can even, when the paint's dry, you can put more pen on top. You can even put more paint on the top. It just gives you lots more options. So as you can see, this is my final painting from the film clip of the 6th of 7 when I was doing the painting bit. This part of the painting looked a lot darker than it does now, because watercolour paints dry lighter. So what I'm going to have a go at today is I'm going to leave this bit down here. I really liked how the blues and these oranges were merging, but I'd like to give it a bit more line and a little bit more watercolour, a bit more intensity, because if we go back and have a look at hers, these, by the way, are really large. They're about 1/2 metre tall or more, so you know, it's a little picture, but I can see that she's built up her colour a little bit more in area. So that's what I think I'm going to have a go at, sort of round here. Also, be prepared for something that's not going to look quite the same as Sunga Park's or even mine. Every time you try something new, it may not, as long as you aim towards it, it may not turn out exactly how you want it to be. But just because it doesn't turn out exactly how you want it to be doesn't mean that it's a failure or it's not correct. But you can pick out areas, and maybe you just come up with your own style through trying it. I think the important thing is to try it, and don't let it put you off, and don't let it stop you trying. Okay, so it might take you 4, 5, 6 tries to get something that you're happy with, but at least you'll have something at the end of the day. Right, so I have my references. I have her works just to check, my secondary source off the internet just to check. I'm going to make sure that I focus on these areas that I want darker, and I'm going to go quiet, and the film might speed up in a little bit, so I don't always work that fast.